I'm Andrew Whitmarsh, curator of the D-Day story, and I'm here on LCT 7074, the landing craft that's also part of our museum. We're making this video today, film Pressure, which is coming out in cinemas on the 9th of September. Amphibious operations are always really difficult, and particularly if there's poor weather, that can really cause problems for them. So in the lead up to D-Day, the Allied commanders, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, met regularly to hear updates on the weather forecast and to take the decision about whether the conditions were suitable for launching D-Day. And that's what the film Pressure is all about. We don't have anything in the D-Day stories collections about the forecast that were presented to Eisenhower, so instead, in this video, we'll be providing some wider context to the whole story. Why was weather such a big concern, and what effect could poor weather have had on D-Day? The Allied fleet for D-Day was setting out from ports and harbours all along the south coast of England and further as well. The Allies had to use such a long stretch of coastline because of the number of troops and ships and landing craft involved, and even using that many different embarkation points, it still took several days for them all to load up. The Sherman tank that our tank here is painted to represent was from 7th Armoured Division, were carried on this very LCT 7074. And you can see the badge up here of 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, on the front of the tank. And the tanks carried by this LCT were loaded up from the east coast, from Harwich and Essex, rather than from the south coast, because they were part of the follow-on forces, not part of the forces that were going to capture the beach itself, but they were going to come along later towards the end of D-Day. In actual fact, they ended up landing on the 7th of June, but they were to carry on the assault and push further inland rather than seizing the beaches themselves. So the original tank that this tank here depicts loaded onto this LCT along with the 9 other tanks that were on board on the 2nd of June, so quite far ahead of D-Day. At that point, D-Day was planned for the 5th of June, but in the end it was postponed by 24 hours because of poor weather. Once at sea, the convoys of landing craft had a long distance to travel. Most of them didn't go directly to Normandy, but they'd travel along the south coast until they got near the Isle of Wight and then turn south towards France along lanes cleared through the German minefields. The diary of the second in command of LCT 7074 states that only half an hour before they were due to set off for France on the morning of the 4th of June, they were told that the operation had been postponed. And then they set off early on the 5th of June and arrived at Normandy nearly 36 hours later on the evening of D-Day. And so if you consider how long the crossing was, how long this landing craft was underway, that was a long time for weather to potentially disrupt its passage. Many of the landing craft like this one went at a slow speed and had flat bottoms so they could land troops on a beach, and that made them hard to handle in rough seas. These orders were issued to Lieutenant Phillips Winkley, RNVR, who was the commanding officer of LCT 979, which was to land tanks on Sword Beach about 45 minutes into the invasion. And these orders give the speed at which this convoy would cross the channel, 6 knots, or about 7 miles per hour. Strong winds and stormy seas could delay or disperse the slow-moving convoys and incapacitate the troops due to seasickness, so an accurate weather forecast was really important. Once the landing craft got to the beaches, then poor weather, such as strong wind and heavy surf, could make the landings a lot harder. The small landing craft could be swamped or blown off course, so that units might land at different places from where they're intended. And troops could drown while they were trying to wade ashore, carrying all their heavy equipment. Many parts of the Allied plan depended on troops landing all in the right place and also in the right sequence. And if some troops landed in the wrong place or at the wrong time, that could then have an effect on other parts of the plan. Low cloud and poor visibility along the coast would make it harder for the air and naval forces to support the landings. And it'd be harder for aircraft to drop bombs or for warships to fire their guns in support of the troops on shore if they couldn't really see the beach. These pages from the orders for the US beaches provide a summary of issues relating to weather, including wave height, wind, visibility, how weather affects flying conditions, conditions for laying smoke to screen Allied forces by boats, aircraft or firing shells, wind direction, the height of breaking waves on the beach, etc. They also mention civil and nautical twilight, which are the times when the sun is below the horizon but there's still some light, and also phases of the moon. On either side of the beach landings, there were thousands of American, British and Canadian paratroops and airborne troops who'd been landing by parachute and by glider. Their job was to protect either side of the beaches from enemy counterattacks. And the airborne troops were heavily affected by the weather. If there was lots of cloud, it would reduce the amount of moonlight, which was important so that the aircraft dropping the paratroops and towing the gliders could see where they were and deliver them to the right place. And strong winds could scatter the parachutists, so it would take them much longer to all get back together again once they're on the ground. The Allied commanders, led by General Eisenhower, had to take the weather into account when they were deciding whether the day was suitable for launching D-Day. But it would be too simplistic to say that the weather conditions were the only thing that they thought about. By early June, Allied land and naval forces were assembled along much of the south coast of England, and the longer that they were there waiting, the greater the chance that the Germans would realise that something was up. They might have realised that D-Day was imminent, and they knew that D-Day was coming soon, but they might have realised that D-Day was only days away. And also they might have given some clues as to the exact location of D-Day, i.e. that the landings would be taking place in Normandy rather than somewhere else. And either of these two things could enable the Germans to move more troops, more reinforcements to Normandy and make the landing for the Allied troops on D-Day even harder. And also, the longer that the Allied troops were kept waiting in camp or on board ship, there was the risk that their morale could be affected. They could just get low morale from hanging around too long, and also their condition could decrease because they had just been sitting around for too long, not doing any training. So these were all factors that the Allied commanders would have been considering. It wasn't just about the weather, they had all these other things going on at the back of their minds as well. Another factor that was complicating the decision made by Eisenhower and the other Allied commanders was that they didn't have the option of landing on any possible day. There were only certain windows of a few days at a time that were suitable for the requirements that the Allies had for the landings. So the first set of days that were suitable were the 5th to the 7th of June, and then the next set were the 19th to the 21st of June. So why would they have these really specific windows? There were several different factors that needed to all come together to make the conditions suitable for the landings from the Allies' point of view. And the first one was to have a low tide that was soon after dawn. And the reason for this was that the Germans had put many beach obstacles on the beaches. These were constructed to try and sink Allied landing craft as they were landing, but if the Allies landed soon after low tide, then the beach obstacles would still be high and dry. They wouldn't be underwater. And the hope was that the Allied naval and engineer personnel could destroy the obstacles, or at least clear lanes before the tide rose and actually reach obstacles. And that would mean that troops or landing craft after that could have a better chance of getting through those obstacles without the landing craft being sunk. The Germans had laid these beach obstacles in lines along the coast, as this map shows. The beach obstacles are marked in purple. In fact, on D-Day, the weather, and particularly the wind, meant that the tide effectively came in faster than expected. This was particularly a problem on Juno Beach. The landings there were scheduled to begin later than on the other beaches to make sure there was enough water over a shoal off the beach for the landing craft to cross it. This diagram represents the slope of the beach at Omaha and could be used to help understand how far up the beach different types of landing craft could get at different tidal states. Another requirement was to have a full moon, or nearly a full moon, and this was so that the bomber aircraft that were attacking the German defences overnight before the troops started landing could see to accurately bomb the right targets. And also it would help the aircraft carrying the airborne troops by having a good amount of moonlight. Those aircraft would then be able to deliver the airborne troops to the right places. Low tides shift slightly each day, and therefore the time that the landings would start, known as H-hour, varied on each different day that was a possibility for the landings. These orders were issued to Lieutenant Peter Saunders, RNVR, commanding officer of LCT 569, landing on the west side of Juno Beach. And on the 6th of June, H-hour was planned for 7:35 on the 6th of June. But if it had been on the 5th of June, H-hour was for 6:55. And if it had been on the 7th of June, H-hour would have been at 8:10. In fact, the actual landings on D-Day were slightly later. The weather on D-Day wasn't perfect, and many of the things I've mentioned, such as landing craft getting swamped or troops struggling to get up the beach through the surf onto the shore, were actually a problem to a certain extent. So the conditions were not great, but they were good enough to launch the landings, or at least that's the opinion from the commander's point of view, if you like. Obviously, if you've asked many of the individual Allied personnel, the naval and military personnel who were going through those conditions, they'd probably have had something different to say about how suitable the conditions were. D-Day was originally planned for the 5th of June, but based on the weather forecast that he'd received, General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, decided to delay the landings by 24 hours to the 6th of June. The timing of exactly when those decisions were taken by Eisenhower and the other Allied commanders were determined partly by the time that it took to send messages out to all of the ships and all the convoys waiting at different places along the coast. And also depended on the time that those different ships would have had to set out from to get over to Normandy according to the overall plan. So it wasn't just a matter of telephoning a few headquarters to say the time had changed. The message had to get to each individual ship and landing craft that was taking part in the operation. LCT 7073 was also in the Harwich area, like this landing craft 7074, and this is the envelope that in which Kenneth Sanderson, the commanding officer of LCT 7073, received the message that D-Day would be on the 6th of June. And you can see on the back that it's sealed with wax to make it clearer if it had been tampered with. This was because the date and time of D-Day had to be kept highly secret. And here's the actual message sent to the commanding officer of LCT 7073, giving the date and time of D-Day and H hour that was inside this envelope. So this has been a brief look at why the weather was such an important factor on D-Day, why Eisenhower and the other Allied commanders needed those regular weather forecasts, and why they spent all that effort into taking a decision about thinking about why the conditions were suitable for launching D-Day. And the crews and the troops on board this landing craft, LCT 7074, and many other landing craft like it, wouldn't have been aware of all those decisions, but it was with the impact of the weather on these landing craft and these troops, that was what the Allied commanders were thinking about.